Hi. Two lobbying groups that represent business interests and millionaires in Rhode Island put out a video recently targeting members of the Rhode Island House of Representatives and opposing legislation that would raise taxes on the richest 1% of Rhode Islanders. In the video, Lori White of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce and Michael DiBiase of the Rhode Island Public Expenditures Council, RIPEC, make a host of misleading and sometimes contradictory claims about the proposed tax hike on the richest 1% of Rhode Islanders. To evaluate the claims of the Chamber and RIPEC, Uprise Rhode Island has invited House sponsors of the bills that aim to raise taxes on the richest 1% of Rhode Islanders, Representatives Karen Alzate and Greg Amore. Representative Amore could not be on tonight because he has committee hearings, but he sent a short statement, which I'll read later. In addition, Uprise has invited three people who are used to refuting the false narratives that apologists for the rich and powerful deploy against working people. That would be Andy Boardman, Alan Krinsky, and Tom Seguros. I'm Steve Alquist, editor and founder of Uprise Rhode Island, and welcome to this important forum, which will be centered on facts and data, not the narratives of corporate lobbyists. Representative Karen Alzate, Democrat, District 60, Pawtucket. Can you explain what your bill H5227 does and why it's needed?
Yeah. So thank you for having me on here. I love talking about this bill. So really trying to keep it simple because I understand that reading the bill sometimes gets very wordy and it gets complicated for some of us who, don't live this life every day. So H5227, what it's looking to do is we want to raise the tax bracket for our 1%ers in Rhode Island, right? So as of right now, anybody in Rhode Island who would be considered a 1%er, right, making tons of money, they are at a tax bracket of 5.99%. If you compare that to, what we would call the 99%, we're at a 12.9%. My number might be wrong, but that's still a really big gap, right? I know that I'm not too far off from it. So what this bill will do is we're going to increase the tax bracket for them from 5.99% to 8.9%. So it's only 3% higher. And what we're doing is we're targeting a group of people who make over $475,000. And so to kind of put it in math equations, if you will, right now we will, if we, when we pass this legislation, okay, we got to speak it into existence. If you are somebody that makes over 475, we will tax you an extra $750 a year. So when you look at that, it doesn't really look like, rent is much higher, right? If you're somebody that makes over $1 million, we're gonna tax you at 8.9%, and you're gonna pay about $15,000 a year. Again, that's not a lot of money for people who make $1 million. So it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. And so what we're looking is this legislation is needed, especially because of COVID. Last year, when we introduced the bill, there was a lot of, kickback and, a lot of, we don't really need this right now, or, we're not, this is not like super important legislation. Okay, fair. But now that we have COVID, if anything, COVID has pushed us into having to put this legislation up and really fight for it. So the 1%ers in the whole country actually made out during COVID. Mm-hmm. They didn't lose their housing. They didn't ask for social services. They didn't need any assistance, versus almost the rest of the country, were facing evictions, were losing their homes, lost their jobs, and spent all of their savings, and we're looking for social services like food stamps and rent relief and health insurance. That's something that we saw that was really, really big. And that's exactly why this legislation is needed now. We can no longer wait for somebody to come and save us. The federal government, that money is great as of right now because we really need it, but that's not going to last forever. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't receive any more federal funding than we have been. because that's also going to put us in a really bad position nationally. So we can't depend on the money that the federal government is giving us now. We have to take action now so that next year and the following year, we're not still having the same conversation of, people being evicted, we don't have any jobs, our economy is so bad. The great thing about this legislation is that we will be able to raise or increase revenue for the state by $128 million approximately. That's, it doesn't seem like a huge amount compared to the money that we actually need and what's happening in the state budget. But to have an extra $128 million in revenue, that's amazing. We need that revenue. We need it for communities like mine. My district particularly was hit really hard with COVID, and Central Falls is a neighboring city. We need revenue, and we need it right now.
Okay, thank you. Awesome. All right, now I'd like to open it up a little bit because I have these three kind of amazing experts, people I really value here, and I'm going to start with Tom. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself and have a few comments as we go forward?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. My name's Tom Seguris. I'm an engineer and public policy consultant. I've been doing tax projections and budget analyses for 35 years, I guess, for really whoever is interested.
And then Alan Krinsky with EPI. Would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Sure. I'm Alan Krinsky, a senior policy analyst with the Economic Progress Institute. I specialize in state budget, taxes, wages, economic development, and related issues. And thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much for being on. And finally, Andrew Boardman, Andy Boardman, calling in from out of state, I guess.
I am. Yeah, thanks, Steve. And it's a pleasure to be here among just a group of folks who have immense knowledge and passion about this topic. So it's a privilege to be included. Yeah, I'm Andy Boardman, economic policy researcher. I crunch numbers for fun in Rhode Island, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think we'll get into a really passionate and interesting conversation. So I won't say too much about the legislation, but I will just start us off with a few data points, which is that from 1975 to 2015, the inflation-adjusted pre-tax income of the richest 10% of Rhode Islanders rose 86%. By contrast, the income of the other 90% rose just 36%. So there's just been an explosion of economic inequality measured inflation adjusted and pre-tax in the state. It's so bad that at this point, according to the most recent IRS data, the top 1% receive as much income as the bottom 50% combined. And that's, of course, pre-tax, but our tax system is not really helping too much, right? So in 1975, the top marginal tax rate in Rhode Island was 17%. It was 17% in 1975. Today, of course, as we'll discuss, it's 5.99%. And so, over the past 35 years or so, there has been 45 years? Yeah. There has been just an explosion of economic inequality. And at the same time, our income tax system has seen a progressive lowering of the top tax rate. And so I do think it's time to do something about that. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation about how and why.
Cool.
I would just say that, in terms of the progressivity of the system, so the income tax is moderately progressive in Rhode Island, but it's really going to be more progressive. In other words, someone who makes, say, $160,000 a year, they're paying the same 5.99% on that last $10,000. The bracket cuts off at about $150,000, as a millionaire is paying on their last $10,000. So it could be more progressive in that sense. But furthermore, when you take all taxes, local and state taxes into account, you take property and sales tax as well, that's where it really flips. And I think that's what Representative Alzate was referring to earlier, that the top 1% pay sort of an effective local and state tax rate of about 8% when you add sales and property tax on, whereas the bottom 20% pay 14.1%. Those numbers come from a national part of ours, ITEP, the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy. So when you put all those local and state taxes together, then it really flips, and it's pretty aggressive.
So this claim that the tax burden on Rhode Islanders is fairly progressive isn't really taking into account the entire taxes that we all pay. It doesn't really look at the totality of taxes in Rhode Island.
Yes, exactly. And not only that, because of the state's history of the past 30 years of refusing to fund local schools and municipal services, we've actually increased the reliance on the property tax, which is a regressive tax, and that has just made the structure that Alan is talking about worse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to kind of help bridge the conversation here into something that I know we wanted to talk about, which is the Tax Foundation rankings. If you actually look at the rankings, where Rhode Island ranks the lowest in that ranking is actually on our local property taxes, right? And so just as Tom said, that dynamic has actually been worsened by income tax cuts at the state level for the wealthy.
That's interesting. Now, well, let's get into the Tax Foundation a little bit, because I asked Alan to look into this a little bit. I don't know that these state rankings make all that much sense. That when we take a big aggregate look at all this, well, you say Rhode Island has all these different numbers, all these different measurements, then we put them all together and we assign it a number, and then we say in Rhode Island ranks 35 or 45 or 50 or 50 in the states. What does that look like? Well, how does that work?
So this is, I mean, it's fascinating, this whole business climate thing that comes up every few months. It's not clear what it's measuring. So first of all, there are about, I think, 4 different ones, and different states fall in different places, sometimes to the top or bottom on different ones. So they're not consistent themselves. And what's really interesting about the Tax Foundation one in particular is that it's not a business climate index. It's a business tax climate index. So all they're measuring is tax rates. They're not measuring other kinds of things like, I don't know, schools, education, training, public services, other things that make business attractive, make a place attractive for businesses. So they're measuring only on that one thing. And the entire idea that there's one business climate for a state, an entire state, even the size of Rhode Island, and for all different kinds of businesses is sort of nutty to begin with. So it's not clear, and then it's not clear what it's measuring, and even if it's, and there's no evidence that these climate indexes actually measure business growth or economic growth. In other words, the studies that I've looked at that have not shown any sort of correlation between how you rank on that and how business, what kind of prosperity there is in the state. So it's not clear how effective it is, or what it's measuring, despite the claims about a state tax system. I have some other. Again, the other thing to point out is that the business taxes, business taxes, but taxes in general, are a very small portion of the expenses of a business owner. A lot of what I have from about the climate rankings comes from a website called gradingstates.org, Peter Fisher. A lot of great information. And his numbers show that on average, businesses spend about 2% of their expenses are on taxes, or on state and local taxes. And I've seen some numbers slightly higher, but it's relatively small. I mean, businesses have lots of other expenses, renting, wages, obviously, and salaries, that are much more of what it takes to run a business. So it's not clear that this small percent that are taxes really is motivating a lot of business decisions. And then even within that, So property tax, the individual income tax, and we're talking about the bill, Rebel Zaidi's bill, accounts for only 7.5% of that sort of 2%, that small amount, along with the property. The property tax is the largest one that a business owner might face. And yet the tax foundation, when they rank all their taxes, they rank the individual income tax rate at about 30%, even though it's only about 7.5% of the expenses. And they downgrade the property tax element in there. So for a lot of these reasons, these business climates rankings, particularly this one that's about taxes only, not other things, is not really a good indicator of what makes a place prosperous or what motivates business owners to make their decisions.
It seems like it's more effective as a lobbying tool and as a talking point to bring to representatives. Like it's a list of something you can show people and say, hey, look how bad this is. But it doesn't actually have to make any real sense. It just has to be a list and say, we have a title and here's what we think.
And there are, of course, there's literally infinite number of ways to rank states, right? If you can have some sort of measurement of anything, you can rank states based on it, right? And so I think the choice of which indexes and rankings folks choose to focus on actually tells you a lot about what they value. And so, for instance, Kids Count RI calculates that Rhode Island has the highest child poverty rate in New England. That's a ranking as well. And maybe that's a ranking that, lawmakers should be more focused on than a very abstract tax climate ranking.
Interesting. Anyone else before we move on? Because there's something about this tax foundation and tax rates also that is brought up a lot. And it was brought up in the video that I mentioned. People leaving the state because of high taxes. Is that a thing?
Of course it's a thing, but is it a significant thing? And does it also ignore the rich people who move to the state? I mean, yeah, there's obviously always going to be some accountant somewhere who tells their client, yes, you should move to Florida, and the client is more interested in their pocketbook than their community, and so they go, right? I mean, that's going to happen. Is it a significant enough number to care? And are those people who are moving, are they actually taking their jobs with them? If somebody's earning $500,000 because they are the president of a company that's based here, who cares if they move to Florida? The company will just hire somebody else.
Right.
I mean, it's a crazy sort of distracting thing, and it always comes up because you always are able to find somebody who to say, I now live in Fort Lauderdale because, but like, if that's what those people care about, let them move to Fort Lauderdale and let us solve the problems on our own. There's no data to say that this is a significant problem in a public policy way, and there's plenty of data to say that that the collection of taxes play a minimal role, if any, in people's decisions to move.
Yeah, I would say that RIPEC has described the data on migration as compelling, and I would agree it's compelling, but it's compelling in the opposite way that they're suggesting. It's compelling that there's very little influence that tax policy, especially marginal tax rates, are playing on people's decisions. We put out at EPI a report about a year ago that's available on our website about the millionaire migration myth, where we present data in general and for Rhode Island, and for there are decades of data that show sort of consistent rates, sort of under 3% of people moving out, and slightly, and people then moving in. So overall, it's at 1% on balance at sort of for most of those years, except for like 4 years of the people leaving Rhode Island. So it's a very small number. And the fact is that for many of those years, the people in the highest income group have a lower rate of migration. So from 2011 to 2018, we show in the report, the net migration in the highest income group for there, it's 200,000 plus a year. It's been higher than that of all filers on average for 5 of 7 years. And in 3 of those years, that highest income group had a higher in-migration rate. So
that means they came here.
That means, yes.
Yeah.
Right. So they're always, like Tom was saying, always people leaving, coming and leaving. And so it's actually the case that people who are wealthier tend to move less. So we've heard from Rebecca that they're more mobile, but the truth is they're less mobile, and they're less mobile because they're really embedded in their communities, in their social and their business networks. And the scholar Cristobal Young and his colleagues did a study. They used 45 million tax records over 13 years of filings. And they found that whereas the annual interstate migration rate, this is all states, not just Rhode Island, was about 2.9% for all filers. It was only 2.4% for millionaires and 2.0% for millionaires who were business owners. And those who were married and had children were also less likely to move than those who did not. So, and the longer a person was a millionaire, the less likely they were to move. So the evidence suggests that people are not leaving so easily, especially the wealthy. And it's hard to think that, Ray Alzadi was saying that for someone with $1 million in income, they're going to pay another $15,000, $16,000 under this plan, that they're going to pick up and move their whole life and their family and their business over $16,000. So, right, you can always find anecdotes, people have done it, but it's not going to be a major issue in marginal tax rates and people making decisions like this. Cool.
Anyone else? I'll go on here because one of the things that got me really interested in this was Representative Alzate. You put out a tweet that said that this is not a tax on small businesses, right? Because that's how it was being played by the Providence Chamber and RIPEC. They were saying this is a tax on small businesses. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Lori White, who's the president of the chamber, called it neighborhood small businesses. And I'm thinking, like, my dry cleaner, like my, the local liquor store, that guy's making $400,000.
Well, look, she's trying to make a point, but she's only making half of the point, right? Okay. It possibly is true that if somebody owns a small store or somebody owns a cleaner or something like, it's possibly true that all the income from that cleaning company is passing through to their personal income tax. Mm-hmm. That could be true, and it might. For a business of not even that big of a size, it might be a couple $1 million, or who knows. But somebody who has arranged their taxes that way, the expenses of that store are also passing through their personal income tax.
Interesting.
And so they may have $2 million of income, but that it's much more likely that they have like $1.9 million worth of expenses that they're paying. I mean, so. It's an absurd point to make. Right. I mean, if somebody is actually clearing $1 million a year from their neighborhood store, good for them. But I bet that's a person who actually cares about the health of their community. And would that person mind offering 3% more of the last of the top half of their income? I'm not really seeing it. So
that's Tom. That's such a great point, and I think that's I think you have to look at it from the perspective, like all perspectives, right, and not just business perspective. So look at it the fact that I am a woman of color in a hugely diverse community. Do you think that I would really put in a legislation that would harm the small businesses? That's one, right? So that's one. It's my favorite argument, right? Because that doesn't make sense. 2, Rhode Island is a small business state. So we were not going to be hurting small business. The intent is not to hurt small businesses. And then also, if you are a small business who takes home $475, right? If that is just like what you said, Tom, if you take more than $475 home for your own personal, you're not considered a small business.
Well, you might be a small business, but you're a pretty successful and prosperous one.
Exactly.
And why don't you give a little back to your community?
And these neighborhood small businesses, I don't know where, to me, it just doesn't add up. Like where's all this coming from? And you're right. If you are making that much money, you care about your community. You probably either live in a surrounding community, if not in the community, and you're not going to get up and go. And so when I keep hearing
that's right, because you've got a business here.
Exactly. When I keep hearing that they're going to get up and leave, or that this is going to hurt small businesses, we want to put money into small businesses, especially after COVID.
Right.
You know, when Representative Alzate just said it doesn't add up, that's exactly the same thought that I had when I heard this point made. Actually, what came to my head was the old Marx Brothers line. You know, who are you going to trust, me or your own eyes? Right? It just doesn't make sense, right? Neighborhood small businesses. And so I actually did go and track down the IRS data on this, which is all publicly available. So in Rhode Island, there are about 27,000 pass-through S corp and partnership filers each year. About 27,000. 24,000 of them are in the bottom 99% of the individual income tax distribution. So 24,000 of those pass-through corporations are not going to be affected by this legislation whatsoever. So it's only about the top 10% of pass-through partnership and S corps would actually see any impact tax-wise. And so if you ask, well, what are these top 10% of pass-through corporations? What do they do? Are they, your neighborhood small businesses, your dry cleaner? And it's very unlikely, right?
Law firm.
Overwhelmingly, exactly. Overwhelmingly, there's a really great paper on pass-through income and income inequality called Capitalists in the 21st Century that I encourage anybody who's interested in this to look at. And yeah, it does find that in the top 1%, the pass-through corporations are, by and large, they're elite lawyers, they are physicians and dentists, and they are corporate consultants. And so, if those folks are the folks that we're talking about, that's a far cry from, I think what most people imagine when you invoke a neighborhood small business. When I was in Rhode Island, I worked for a number of restaurants and other small businesses. And I think that's what folks think about. They think about the mom and pop shop on Main Street. And flat out, that's just not what we're talking about here at all. And so, who are you going to trust, me or your own eyes, is kind of what this comes down to. And that's what the data bears out. It's really kind of, it's an innovative talking point. I actually hadn't heard this one before, and that's why I tracked down this data. And it turns out that the reason you don't hear this talking point a lot is because there's actually very little veracity to it.
Interesting.
No, there's also like tens of thousands, and on top of that, tens of thousands of I guess, small businesses that are sole proprietorships, where people are self-employed, that, also very few of them, just by the numbers, if we have about 5,000 or so taxpayers, which would be individual or families in the top 1%, and we have, tens and tens of thousands, I think maybe up to 100,000 small businesses in the state, then they can't all be in that top 1% and being harmed.
Right. Given that, Alan, I thought we had an interesting little exchange earlier about the ways that small businesses are already being helped through the PPP loan forgiveness program. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So this is interesting stuff that's of big concern right now, because the budget deals with it. And so the payroll protection program indeed has helped many small businesses, and I guess large businesses too. And the idea of the program is to give these business owners money to help pay for wages and other expenses to keep them in business during the crisis. And part of the program was that if you follow the rules, the loans would be forgiven. And so in a normal tax policy, if you have a forgiven loan, you need to count it as income. and you count it as income and you deduct the expenses, and it's sort of a wash.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you don't count it as income and you don't count the expenses, it's also a wash. But what Congress decided to do, and this stays on the federal level, whatever Rhode Island does, is they said, we're going to not count that forgiven loan as income like you usually do, but we're going to let you take deductions for the expenses on income you're not claiming. So it's sort of like if your health insurance paid for 100% for some surgery or costs, and then you deducted the medical expenses from your personal taxes, or your employer sent you on a trip and paid for all your travel expenses, and then you claimed on your personal taxes the travel expenses. And so Rhode Island stays coupled to federal policy by law. So that's going to happen in Rhode Island unless we do what's called decoupling. And the governor in the budget has a proposal to partially decouple, but would still allow this, I guess, extra tax giveaway for many businesses, and even has a clause that would let the tax administrator use federal relief funds to cover the whole thing. And so I think this is a bad idea. And the truth is that even if you say this is going to help businesses more, in order to take advantage of the deduction, you have to have income and tax liability to use the deduction against. So for the businesses that are really hurting and don't have tax liability because their income's down so much, then this extra bonus from the PPP program is not going to help. It's going to help businesses that can have the room to make those deductions. And so there are probably better ways to help small businesses, which we should do, using the same revenue.
Yeah, and Alan, just to put some concrete figures on that, which I agree with you 100%, the state OMB estimates that it punches a hole in the state budget of about $133 million in FY22. And so it is just causing a gigantic hole in the budget relative to other policy changes that have impacted the budget. And Alan, I completely agree with you. I think that lawmakers and policymakers should take a more targeted approach, because to be sure, there are a lot of small businesses that are still hurting out there and they deserve support. But I just think that they should be targeted, that the state should be targeted so that they can get help to the businesses that need it the most.
Right. But the effort to decouple here and elsewhere is being portrayed as imposing a tax on businesses, when the truth is it's not a tax or a new tax. It's sort of an extra bonus beyond the original program.
That 130 million number sounds suspiciously like the amount that Representative Elzate's bill would be able to generate in the state as well. Just as an aside, I think we have about 5 more minutes, and I don't want to keep everybody here all night, but I did want to touch on a couple of quick ideas. Will philanthropic groups suffer because rich people won't have money to give to charity anymore? Is it a slippery slope, your bill, so that down the road we're going to be increasing taxes on people who make more than 300,000, 100,000, 50,000, and so we'll just keep increasing taxes on, let's say, the relatively poor and moderate income levels? Is that something that will happen? And I think anybody can speak on these ideas as we get ready to sign off.
For 40 years, for my entire adult life, we've been living under this crazy idea that we can just slash government and that things will get better. And that is, it was false when it was begun 40 years ago. It's false now. It was a terrible bargain then, and it's a terrible bargain now. And I mean, I would actually like my taxes to be a little higher if it meant that my children would have better educational opportunities. Mm-hmm. If it meant that I didn't have to wait an hour for the bus to come in the morning. If it meant that that I could be proud of the way that our state is run. If it meant that we had state services that would actually help people, as opposed to just always being on the ragged edge of existing. We have such potential in this state. We have great people. We have a great location. There's all kinds of things that are wonderful about here. What we need is the vision to actually invest in it, and to imagine that having some government direction over where money gets spent would actually make more lives better. And so I want to push back as hard as I can on the idea that the only way forward is through tax cuts. It's just a bogus way to run a state, and it has done us nothing but harm over the last decades.
Right.
And it's just got to stop. And the history is there. I mean, we cut taxes repeatedly in the 80s. We cut them in the 90s. We cut them in 2010. You know, they're claiming they're trying to make this claim that these tax cuts on the rich are revenue neutral. That's totally bogus. What's revenue neutral is the year that they decided to make the temporary cuts permanent. That was revenue neutral, right? But you can't cut taxes and have it be revenue neutral. We've cut so much. And not only that, we continue to cut taxes. This year, we are proposing, what is the number? Somewhere north of $80 million is the next step of the car tax cut.
Oh, yeah.
This is a cut that is only going to go for people whose cars are worth more than about $4,000, right? I mean, this is like the definition of a regressive tax cut. We are going to spend that money without any plan for what we're going to cut to replace it, right? We're just going to squeeze harder on this stone that we've been squeezing for decades, and it's just crazy.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll just jump in and piggyback off of the the revenue neutral quote unquote argument. This is one of the more like shameful talking points out there. It's a shell game. It's a misdirection and it's a lie. And I think everybody who makes this argument knows that they're being dishonest, but they just say it anyway, right? So there was, as Tom referenced, the 2010 personal income tax reform that was more or less, a wash. It was more or less revenue neutral. It made the alternative flat tax into a permanent tax. So it shifted more high earners over to that tax. And it also eliminated some credits and deductions that those folks were using. And so on net, it was basically a wash. It was revenue neutral. And, everybody loves in the business community and the conservative side loves to talk about that. What they don't talk about is exactly as Tom said, that what it did was actually it further enacted the lower top tax rate, which was kicked off by Governor Kachiri and Speaker Murphy in 2006. And I think, Tom, you estimated at the time that it would be like, north of, I want to say like 130, 120 million each year would be foregone with that cut. And, that's still ongoing. We're still living with those cuts year after year, that there was no plan to pay for it. And, I do just want to emphasize that anytime you hear this argument that there haven't been any tax cuts because the 2010 reform was revenue neutral, people that are making that argument know that they're lying. They know that they're being dishonest, right? And so Speaker Mattiello actually tried to make this argument in 2015 in an interview. He said, realistically, there have not been any tax cuts in Rhode Island for the rich because the 2010 reform was revenue neutral and it was not a tax cut for the rich. And PolitiFact actually picked that up and they rated it as just flat out false because of the 2006 tax cut. And so,
yeah,
you hear this all the time.
Not to mention the 2001 tax cut and the 1997 tax cut.
97, yes, the
tax cut, and the 1993, I think. Well, there was a hike in between there, but like this is the reality is that taxes have been ratcheting down for decades, and what do we have to show for it? Not very much.
I'll just add, and then I'll stop talking, is one of my favorite all-time Rhode Island politics quotes, and I found this while I was digging through the Projo archives a few years ago, is during the debate for the 2006 tax cut, Representative William Sanbento, who I believe recently passed away, so rest in peace, he said on the House floor, this is a Democrat, admitted I'm in favor of this legislation, even though I really don't think it's going to help the poor or the middle class. And that's honesty. That's honesty. Okay. Everybody was talking about, oh, the decision makers, and it's going to attract jobs, and it's going to, he just said flat out, I'll vote for it. I don't believe any of this BS. It's not going to help the poor. It's not going to help the middle class. And, you got to give credit for that honesty, at least.
At least.
I the biggest thing for me on this bill, right, is this bill is going to help working families like mine and people in my community, specifically all of Pawtucket. We can't continue to say that, to everybody's point, is that cutting taxes was a good thing. Cutting taxes is never a good thing, especially when it's not benefiting low income Black and brown communities. So I will continue to fight for this legislation, because the facts are there, the numbers are there, and the reality is that it's going to help all Rhode Islanders, not just a portion, and it's not going to hurt anybody. So I'm really passionate about this work, and I appreciate all of the economic talk on this, because I'm definitely learning a lot.
Me too. I want to thank everybody. Oh yeah, go ahead, Alan, please.
That tax policy is not some neutral thing, even when it seems neutral. And so we have these racial and ethnic disparities in income and wealth that go back decades, in part through tax policies we've chosen, whether it's housing policy with property taxes and redlining, and in other areas. And I think that we have an opportunity with the one-time federal relief funds that are coming in, and then building on top of that when those run out, and something like this kind of revenue bill could bring in going forward, the opportunity to make those kinds of investments to reverse and address some of those disparities, and to make the kinds of investments in people and communities that Representative Alzate and Tom and we're all talking about, that would actually make people better off, attract businesses. It's not a zero-sum game. There's a new book by Heather McGee that talks about this. It's not a zero-sum game. If we work on this all, together, we can increase prosperity overall.
I want to thank everybody for tonight. I want to call it, because I don't want to go too much longer. This has really been fantastic. Thank you all for being here. You're some of my favorite people in public policy and public world. So I'm really happy to have had this conversation. So thank you again. And let's see what we can do to make this state better. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Another bill from lead sponsor Representative Greg Amore, Democrat, District 65, East Providence, number H5229, would create a new income tax bracket for purposes of Rhode Island income taxation. The new bracket would be 6.99 on taxable income over $500,000, and any personal income tax collected on income over $500,000 would be deposited into a restricted receipt account and only be expended on education for grades kindergarten through and including 12th grade. Rep. Amore could not be here tonight. He had committee meetings, but he did send along this message, and I quote, "Many people believe that there is never a right time to raise any taxes. Those same people understand that the costs of all the other goods and services they purchase rise year over year. Rhode Island faces a structural deficit for as many out years as the eye can see. We have a binary choice: cut important programs, ignore pension funding, and provide less services, or raise revenue through a progressive income tax structure that preserves those programs and services and improves the quality of life for all Rhode Islanders. For over a decade, we have shortchanged our Medicaid reimbursement obligations, and for much longer than that, we have ignored our crumbling school infrastructure and pension obligations. In order to responsibly address these and many other pressing issues, at the same time we address our growing structural deficit, there is no other choice but to generate revenue. I believe this is the fairest approach to that end."